Okay, so the old regulation was WAC 173360, and all we did was add an A on the end of it. So if you've had a chance to look online, the new regulation also has been reorganized into sections 100 through 1,000. So they are not in the same order as it was with the old regulation. So we're thinking maybe within 2 months, if you're on the listserv, we will notify people when a nice printed versions are out. In the meantime, you know, if you like looking on physical rather than online, you can always print out the version that's online. Okay, so sections 100 through 1,000. It is a little bit thicker than our old regulation. So when I'm in the field, I just have sections 100 to 900 with me. Section 1,000 is just as thick, and that's financial responsibility. So if you don't want to have that with you all the time, you can always print out just 100 to 900 and have your field information. Okay. All right. So when does everything have to be done? This is a real common question we get. Okay, so the rule becomes effective October 1st, 2018. So most of the rule does go into effect on that date. There are new things in temporary closure that we're going to go into, and new things on site assessments that Kathy will go into detail on, changes, and all these new changes go into effect right on October 1st, 2018. There are a few exceptions. So we have a section now on walkthrough inspections, and that's normally going to be done by someone the owner designates. So these walkthrough inspections have to be started no later than October 1st, 2019. We also have new operation and maintenance testing requirements that are coming into effect, such as the test of leak detection. A lot of people know that as monitor certs. I think a lot of service providers call it that. It's an annual leak detection that's coming. Sumps that will need to be tested, spill buckets, and overfill prevention equipment. These new tests, if their owner's tag ends in an even number, it'll go into effect by October 1st, 2020. So I like to remember it, even tag, even year number. And if their tag ends in an odd number, it goes into effect October 1st, 2021. So first I'd like to get to know how many service providers are in the room. Raise your hand. And how many owner representatives are in the room. Okay, so we have more owners. Okay, so a lot of owners are already having annual tests, such as their automatic line leak detector, line tests, things like that. If let's say your test is due annually in December. What I would prefer to see, because there's not enough service providers to do everything and everyone in the state in 1 month, is if you're in December and you have an even tag number, I would like you to do your test during your annual cycle on December 2019. Then, by the time October hits around, you're in compliance. Because right now, we've been receiving complaints from owners that my service provider can't get here till X date. When all this happens, I think it's going to be maybe 10 times worse. So we want everyone to continue in their 12. Everyone's got a different month that they're doing their testing. Let's just keep on that. And as a service provider, think of your owners, October 2019, tell them they're going to do their 3-year test now, so that by October 1st the next year they are in compliance and won't be in violation. Any questions on that? And if you have questions during the presentation, we'd rather it be in real time than wait till the end and you probably forgot what you were going to say. Yes? Okay, so the question was, if somebody did the test with an even number tag on October 3rd of 2019, when would that next 3-year test be due? And it would be 3 years from that date. And yes, enforcement discretion, like if you did it October 3rd, 2020, a couple of days, I think most inspectors have common sense, and if we're talking days, it's not going to be a big deal. Did I answer your question?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Okay. So, exemptions. We did change a major definition in exemptions. So, heating oil tanks have always been exempt. We did change one word in the definition because there has been this little gray area. So right now, the new regulations state tanks used solely for heating structures on the property are exempt from the underground storage tank regulations. So what that does is it closes this gray loophole for emergency power generator tanks. If they store heating oil, they are fully regulated. So emergency power generator tank could have waste oil in it. It could have diesel in it. It could have heating oil, whatever. It's fully regulated no matter what kind of product it has in it. So I just want that to be clear. There are some emergency power generator tanks out there that are not registered with Department of Ecology. So be sure, if you have any of these clients, or if you're a hospital and your tank isn't registered, be sure by October 1st, 2018, you get that emergency power generator tank registered with Department of Ecology and in full compliance with the regulations. Record retention. We've had some changes with that. So for the annual line tightness test, keep the last two tests, 2 years. For walkthrough inspections, rectifier inspections, the monthly leak test, if they're doing a 0.2 gallon per hour test, if they're doing a sensor normal test, all those monthly tank records or line records, keep all of those records for 3 years. We used to be 5 years, so we've shortened the time period for record retention on most of those items. There are still a lot of 3-year tests out there and new 3-year tests that are coming. So CP tests are normally 3 years, the spill bucket test, overfill equipment, sump test, and if you have a non-safe suction line, those tests are every 3 years. Those records, we want the last 2 tests, which is a 6-year cycle. Okay. Transfer of records. Right now, there's very little information an owner has to pass on to a new owner when they sell their tank site. So now we have a whole list of things that the current owner has to give the future owner if they sell their site. So you can read all this in the regulation, and the little one-page sheet, 2-sided, is a summary of this whole slideshow. So we've got installation repair, compatibility documents, walkthrough inspections, leak detection printout, rectifier inspections, testing of tanks, piping, CP systems, leak detection, spill buckets, overfill prevention, and sump tests, site assessments and cleanup actions. Last, financial responsibility. So someone yesterday asked, well, how many of these records? So the regulation is silent on that, so we would look towards the record retention section. So if it's 3 years, give them the last 3 copies of the last 3 years. So this will help. Right now, a lot of times when I go to new tank owner sites, they're like, I don't have any records, nothing. So it'll help them become more educated on their new tank system too. A lot of these owners are brand new to tank systems. 30-day notice. Right now, fill out the form as an owner. There's an address on the back. It's an Olympia address. Right now, you need to mail that U.S. Post Office to Olympia. If you wanted a waiver of that 30-day wait time, or if you had a change in the date that you were going to install your tank, you always contact the inspector in your area. So if you're in Seattle, you would contact Drew Imke. He's the inspector for Seattle. So the new regulation says if that install date changes, we want 3 business days prior notice. So you can't tell us Friday about a Monday change. It's got to be 3 business days. Another change is the 30-day notice was always for new tank installation, but if you were replacing a fiberglass line with a new fiberglass line that was same for same, all you did was use the retrofit repair checklist. Well, now we've added a 30-day notice if you're replacing piping or installing new piping. So we want that 30-day notice of the piping replacement. Installation changes. Do we have any installers in here? Okay. So right now you fill out your UST addendum, documenting that you followed all codes of practice, regulations, that you did the install per manufacturer specs. You fill out that UST addendum, give it to the owner. Now you're going to attach the manufacturer's tank install checklist, and that's usually a 30-page checklist. Sometimes it's known as a warranty checklist. So if you're installing a Xerxes tank, you fill out the Xerxes 30-page install. You want to attach a copy of that to the UST addendum now so the owner can submit all that to Department of Revenue for their new tank install. Double wall and interstitial monitoring. So grab some water. The 2005 federal regulations said all the states had to come up with at least as stringent as the feds, and they wanted double wall tanks and double wall piping if any new installs happened. So every state has a different date on this. So if you do work in Oregon or Idaho, this date might be different. So in Washington State, our date was October 1st, 2012, that you had to have double wall tanks or double wall piping. And why this is really a critical date with these new regulations is this instituted a mandatory interstitial monitoring as your primary form of leak detection for your tanks and piping installed on or after October 1st, 2012. So the new regulations are going to have some things that kick in based on if you're required to do or choose voluntarily to do interstitial monitoring as your primary form of leak detection on your piping, some new regulation is going to come into effect. So if you have a single piping run and you want to replace more than 51% of that pipe, you have to remove the whole piping run and replace it with double wall pipe. And it must be interstitially monitored. That was October 1st, 2012. So if you do less than 50%, you could replace, just continue on that less than 50% with single wall piping. So 50% is our cutoff for that replacement into a double wall system. Under dispenser containment, the date here is also October 1st, 2012. If somebody had a dispenser replaced, put a new dispenser on, or just added a new dispenser at a site, they had to have under dispenser containment sump. And safe suction systems are not exempt from this requirement. So you could do Bravo boxes, you just have to have a containment sump. So the people have asked that there's been some companies going around, can we do a spray-in sump? No, that's not been, I don't know any manufacturer of any piping or anything that's allowed that next to their piping. So we put in the new regulation that it must be a manufactured sump or like a machine shop sump. I think you've seen a lot of those steel sumps that, you know, people can make, like a lot of them are at marinas. So spray-in sumps will not be allowed, and that's in the regulation. Yes. So the question was, would they have to replace the other three that they didn't voluntarily want to replace? Anytime an inspector goes to a site, they're looking at every piece of equipment per our checklist and seeing if that equipment meets the minimum standards, performance standards of the regulation. So we would be looking at a spray-in sump to see if it met the regulations, just as we would be looking at a manufactured sump. So without an inspector putting eyes on your site, I can't give an answer whether that inspector would say this doesn't meet the requirements pre-October 2018 or it does. Each site, each sump would be a visual and seeing if it met compatibility, manufacturer spec of that piping that's next to it, all that equipment.
Could we recommend or request a pre-test to come out and check to see if the other stuff's going to be needed, or just the new stuff? You know, I'm going to replace one, so I'm going to put a fiberglass on. The other three may not require them, so you guys will come out and pre-check that for us to make sure.
So the question was, could an owner ask an inspector to pre-check before the service provider went out there? And yes, an owner always has the option of calling an inspector and asking them for technical assistance. We can do a partial technical assistance visit, or we can do a full, significant operational compliance inspection. And if the owner asks us to come, we usually will defer a penalty enforcement unless there's something hazardous to life and health. But when we go to a site and find a violation, we will write up a notice of noncompliance for any violations we see with timelines that the owner can submit paperwork that they came into compliance. So yes. Thank you. Compatibility. Tanks have always had to be compatible with a substance stored in that tank or piping. Now we have an additional part to the compatibility section. If someone is going to switch to greater than 10% ethanol, greater than 20% biodiesel, or switch to a hazardous substance, they must prove through their records by certification by an independent testing laboratory like UL 971, one of the testing laboratories, manufacturer approval, or another option. A lot of you know how to go onto the NWGLDE website and look up third-party certifications. I think some of the compatibility you're going to be able to find on that website. So if you have an owner that's going to do this, let's go to the next slide. The change in product, let's look at the bottom half. If you're switching to the greater than 10% ethanol, greater than 20% diesel, and a hazardous substance, it now requires, after October 1st, 2018, a 30-day notice prior to switching to one of those products. And we have a checklist already online. It's called Alternative Fuel Installation or Conversion Checklist. And that outlines every UST component that comes in contact with any of these products, and you must show proof that it's compatible with these new products. Today, a lot of people have gone to blenders. They've gotten rid of their mid-grade tank. They want their mid-grade now to be diesel. They blend. So nothing's changed there. It's still within 30 days of changing that product. Fill out that retrofit repair checklist. Make sure you've changed the floats if they needed to be changed. And just use that retrofit repair checklist within 30 days of switching from gas to diesel. That doesn't need a 30-day prior notice. So I'm not sure the webinar people heard that. There was a question about E15. Federally, there's been a lot of talk of that happening soon, but in Washington State, there has not been talk of a switch to E15 anytime soon. Okay, walkthrough inspections. So Crystal is going to go into detail on this, so I'm just going to skim through. There's a monthly requirement to the checklist, and there's an annual requirement to the checklist. Washington State has created these checklists. So you could use our checklist for Washington State, or you could use the checklist that's in RP 900. However, EPA has made a regulatory interpretation on that if you choose to use RP 900 walkthrough checklist, they have additional requirements that go above and beyond. So they've got a daily requirement in that checklist, they've got a weekly requirement, then the monthly and annual. So if you choose to use the RP 900 checklist, you must do the daily, weekly, monthly, annual. Or you could use our checklist, or anything that's at least as stringent as the regulation. So there are a lot of majors. They say, we have our own checklist. We do this daily. Yours. So as long as your checklist documents all of this in the regulation, then yes, you can use your own checklist. So there are some, like repeater stations, EPG tanks up on the top of a mountain. Maybe they only get deliveries once a year. If you have deliveries less than monthly, you only have to do the spill bucket inspection during the time of delivery. So if you had a repeater station, delivery once a year, I would attach that delivery to your documented walkthrough inspection and say, this is why I don't have monthly. This is the only delivery I've had this year. And that here is when I checked it. Tanks do corrode. So this was an abandoned tank. It wasn't an operational tank, but cathodic protection, really, really important. So there has been a change in the cathodic protection section of the regulation. So if you have an impressed current system and you're an owner designee and you're checking that rectifier either monthly or every 60 days, if your volts or amps are out of the range of what your tester specified for that rectifier, you must call your tester or a CP expert within 24 hours that you are out of range. So this is a big change in the regulation. Or let's say you go to the rectifier and it's just zero, like you had a lightning strike this week. That happens quite often. You must call your tester or a CP expert within 24 hours. And do we have any CP testers in the room today? Okay. So when they call you, please get them please make sure they schedule an appointment with you to get that repaired or looked at. The full question was, if we have two dispensers, only one of them was hit, they're both direct bury over soil, they had to replace the one dispenser, put a under dispenser containment sump due to the regulation October 1st, 2012. Now they can't have, because of electronics talking to the meter back in the office, the compatibility, they have to change the other dispenser, which then triggers that dispenser under containment sump also. So in that situation, both of the new dispenser replacements would need sumps under the dispenser.
Thank you.
Okay. And I thought I had another slide on something at the beginning, and I didn't see it in there, but I wanted to mention a lot of the dates I'm talking about are for existing tank systems. So if you have a brand new tank installation, October 1st, 2018, all of these regulations come into effect. You have to start your wait you have your sumps tested, of course, during install, but then you wait 3 years. So any new tank or any new pipe installed after October 1st, 2018, all of the regulations come into effect at that date. Okay, so let's get into the operation and maintenance sump 3-year test. Tag even number ending is due by October 2020. Tag odd, October 2021. So the sump every 3-year test is only required if you are using interstitial monitoring on your piping. So there are some owners that may opt, since their piping is older than October 1st, 2012, to switch to an annual line test. That is perfectly fine. They can switch to an annual line test, don't have to do the 3-year sump test. However, just to show how we're a little bit different than Idaho or some other states, if you work in both states, please keep your sump sensors in there. Just because you're going to a line test doesn't mean you should get rid of perfectly good equipment. When an inspector goes to your site, they only look for your primary forms of leak detection. So if you have a pressurized system, we're looking at your automatic line leak detector, that test. We're looking at your annual line tightness test. Okay, so you're in full compliance now with your line testing. If you have sump sensors, that's your deal with your service provider. If you have a leak, that sump sensor is going to alarm. So please don't take them out, even if you go to an annual line test. There are some states that went more stringent than that, and they're saying if the equipment's there, you have to have it tested. So there's some people in other states taking out sensors because they don't want to go through a tertiary way to be in compliance. So Washington State, we're just looking at the regulations. If you're in compliance with an annual line test, your lines were installed before October 1st, 2012. All right, so how do you do it? Well, you can use a code of practice. RP 1200 has great instructions and checklists. So you could use RP 1200 if you have a manufacturer that has a instruction. The state may come out with guidance next year on a low-level hydrostatic test. Right now we're looking at what other states are doing. PMAA has some guidance out there for low-level testing. So maybe within a year we're going to see what's worked in other states, what hasn't, some problems, and we're going to maybe come up with some guidance here that, we'll let other people make the mistakes first, and then we'll come out with some good guidance. So yeah, but right now, use RP 1200 or something that's at least as stringent. There is an exception. First, I'd like to see a show of hands. Has anybody seen a double-walled sump that's interstitially monitored? Okay. What city is that?
It was in Modesto, California.
Oh, okay, okay. So I haven't seen any yet in Washington State, but they could be coming. So if someone decides to install a double-walled sump and they monitor that interstitially, and the requirement is for an annual check of that sump interstitially, then that gets them out of the every 3-year hydrostatic test. Okay?
We have a question, and it is, who's RP 1200?
Okay. Petroleum Equipment Institute, known as PEI, has recommended practices known as RPs, and the RP 1200 outlines operation and maintenance of sump testing and other testing that we will go through in the rest of the slideshow. Okay, today there is a lot of types of sump tests. Again, doing interstitial monitoring on piping, there's a high-level hydrostatic test, and that's what RP 1200 outlines, is that test. There's a low-level hydrostatic test. EPA has regulatory interpretations that they will accept low-level hydrostatic tests. So PMAA has some guidelines, some other states have guidelines. If you're going to use that, show what guidelines you used, just so we know you're following something that shows that sump is liquid tight for the sensor to be able to work. There's also other methods out there. There's vacuum, there's pressure, there's a tracer compound, and who knows, next year there might be another method out there. So if your method can show it tests the tightness of that sump, and maybe there's going to be third-party certifications on those, you can use those. So if you're doing interstitial monitor on your piping, which of those sumps needs the test? So it would be every sump in that piping run that's part of the interstitially monitored system. So on your typical, where you have your dispensers at a high elevation, a transition sump, STP sump, low elevation, it includes the dispenser sumps, even a closed loop system, because you have a single wall riser pipe up to the shear valve that's exposed. So that sump is acting as part of the interstitial system. So closed loop systems are not exempt from the sump being tested.
Question. What fluid is being used for the hydrostatic testing?
RP 1200 is water. I have not seen a hydrostatic test other than water. However, the tracer test is different compounds are used, but it's more of a vapor compound in a smoke. It looks kind of smoky if you see it done. You can maybe Google that and see some good YouTube videos. It's kind of, if you were around during the tracer test of the tank, it's similar to that but easier. It's not like you had to wait a long time in the old days. This is pretty instant. Okay, I think that answered the question. Yeah, okay. Sumps with piping that go between dispensers, all those sumps need to be tested. So after the test, just remember to open up that interstice before you leave, because you want to be sure that inner wall is going to be able to go all the way down to the STP sump and find a potential leak.
We do have another question from our online friends. Is sump testing required for safe suction systems for EPGs with leak detection?
Safe suction lines do not need line leak detection. So therefore, they would not need to do interstitial monitoring as a requirement. So if a safe suction system voluntarily uses interstitial monitoring, they do not have to do the sump test, because safe suction systems do not need leak detection per our regulation. Very good question. So the voluntary interstitial monitoring we're talking about is, I have an old line, I've always used interstitial monitoring, and I want to continue. That's my voluntary choice, but I have a pressurized system, and I don't want to go to an annual line test. So I'm voluntarily choosing that as my regulatory form of leak detection. So then I would be required to do the 3-year sump test. O&M spill bucket 3-year test. Same thing for existing tanks. That would go into effect even tag 2020, odd tag 2021. You can follow a manufacturer instruction or a code of practice, or something at least as stringent as that. So a code of practice that's out there is RP 1200. They have a lot of O&M, how to do these tests. Okay, there is an exception for the spill bucket test. If you have a double wall spill bucket and you have it interstitially monitored and you're documenting that on your walkthrough checklist, every month I'm checking the interstice, inside and the interstice. Then if I've got 3 years of records of those, I don't need to do the hydrostatic 3-year test on that spill bucket because I'm monitoring that interstitial space every single month. So that gets you out of the 3-year hydrostatic. O&M testing for overfill prevention devices goes into effect even tag 2020, on tag 2021. You can follow manufacturer's instructions on how to test that every 3 years, or a code of practice such as RP 1200 has great instructions on how to test each of these equipment. So there's 3 most common types of equipment. So a lot of people in their fill pipes have an automatic shutoff valve. So contrary to what you may see at some of these tank conference shows, there's a magnetic one. You can't just look down the fill pipe and use your magnet and say, yes, the arm is swinging, because you can't see that arm swinging. So EPA's interpretation is you need to take the entire automatic shutoff tube out. It's got to completely come out. You've got to check everything, make sure it's per manufacturer specifications. You've got to check the float. Is it warped? Is it smashed? Is the arm working correctly? Or if it's the slide up and down, whatever type of automatic shutoff, it's got to be working per manufacturer specification. Now, I have heard from service providers that have done this. Due to the ethanol vapors coming up from the tank, it's rusting a lot of these parts, and they're having a hard time getting these automatic shutoffs out. I've seen some pictures that they've had to, destroy the automatic shutoff tube to get it out for inspection. So therefore, it's destroyed, and a new one has to be put in. Do we have any service providers here that have some experience that could maybe say something to this? Yes?
We've kind of started doing this a little preemptively. We've come across quite a few, especially the straight ones that don't want to come out. They haven't been removed in years for numerous reasons, and we are destroying them to get them out. They're about $1,000 a piece that we buy them from. I'd like to bring up another question. We had a service provider in California ask if an internal video inspection, they put a camera in the tank with a light and they operate the flapper from above ground. Will that satisfy? Does it have to be removed from the tank to verify that?
I think if you can verify that every part of this meets the manufacturer specification and your test follows what it says in RP 1200 or another code of practice, or a manufacturer instruction, you would have to show it you completed the test, whether it's in or out.
Well, most things written, they physically remove.
All right. So the question is, does the regulation actually have the word removed, or is it just an EPA's technical compendium? So we will get back to that question before the end of today and answer both sides of that question. Okay.
We do have another question here. What if there's no manufacturer's test methods on overfill device and no third-party test method? Do they have to be replaced?
As far as I know, RP 1200 has testing for both automatic shutoff, exterior alarm, and ball float testing. So there is a recommended practice from Petroleum Equipment Institute that they could follow, which would save them from having to take whatever out. Okay, Crystal
I found it.
has an answer.
It's so easy in these new regulations just to find everything. In section 470, the language says that the overfill equipment must be inspected to verify functionality at least once every 3 years. At a minimum, the inspection must ensure that the equipment is set to activate at the applicable level and will activate when regulated substances reach that level. And then it talks about the code of practices. The language in the regulations doesn't require removal, but it sounds like the codes do.
So the code they use, May, can you next get online and look at EPA's technical compendium?
Yes.
For the other half of that question. So if people didn't hear that, the first half of the question is answered. So Washington State regulation language does not use the word removal. It used the words inspect every part. So a camera could inspect every part, hypothetically. Now we're going to look at EPA's technical compendium and see if they actually have the word removal in there or visual every piece.
Well, since there's inspectors in the room, would inspectors accept?
I have to be as stringent as EPA. So I always go to their technical compendiums, and they do update and add quite often. So I try and go there every month. Okay, Crystal has an answer.
Somebody asked a very specific question. Are tank owners required to pull the automatic shut-off device out of the tank during the periodic overfill inspection process? EPA went quite vague. And, they just basically say you need to make sure it activates at the correct level and when regulated substances reach that. But the regulations do not require it be removed.
Okay.
So, same thing.
Okay. So it must have just been a verbal thing. So there we have it. So the answer from the EPA technical compendium, they do not use the word remove. But, okay. So hypothetically, if your camera could see everything, that it functions,
We have an option.
today we will accept that because our regulations accept that, and EPA's technical compendium, which includes all their regulatory interpretations, accepts it.
And I have seen overfill devices, the flappers be removed, and the float is missing. So as long as whatever you're doing can see that that float is there and that it can freely move up and down, I mean, that's what we would want to be.
I'm not doing yet, but I'm thinking.
Oh, yeah, I know you to be. I know how you work.
These things aren't easy to get out. There's got to be a workaround.
Another question.
Why can't the shutoff be tested with an actual delivery in the presence of a certified provider?
What was the question again?
The question is, why can't the shutoff be tested with an actual delivery in the presence of the certified provider?
Okay. I'll answer that because I have allowed that to be used in the past. However, with today's equipment and some of the complexities, let's say you have an old tank install where you have a ball float with a stem inside the tank at 90%. And I'll just skip to that slide.
I would say it's also pretty unreasonable to ask an inspector to be out on all of our facilities at the time.
Yeah.
We just don't.
Anyway.
The woman power.
No, that's okay. What the regulation, operation, and maintenance of your overfill equipment device needs to show during that test is that if I say I'm using my automatic shutoff, that is going to work with whatever tank equipment I have. So that O&M inspection every 3 years has to prove that that is going to activate at 95%. So if I have a hidden ball float valve with a stem at 90%, that is not going to activate my 95% shutoff, even though it appears to be perfect equipment, a float, a moving arm. So what we had at one of our sites was the ball float disappeared, it got rusted out, but the stem was still in the tank at 90%. The driver just saw the 95% automatic shutoff. So at 2 a.m. when his hose was hooked up and his hose jumped at 90%, he's like, ran back to the ATG, I can put a lot more fuel in this tank. And more fuel and more fuel. All of a sudden, the fuel came up the 90% ball float stem, and the stage 1 vapor recovery went through his hose to the tank, and it spilled out of his hose onto the ground at 2 a.m. He can't unhook. Okay, so you need to show whatever form of overfill prevention device you're using that it will actually work with the equipment on your tank. So does that answer that question? Say the question again.
Why can't the shutoff be tested with an actual delivery in the presence of a certified US provider?
It sounds like you're trying to overfill.
Yeah, so his hose would jump at 90%, and if you're trying to say my 95% automatic shutoff works, you just showed it didn't work. So I hope that's answering the question. Use RP 1200. Really, it's what's out there to test these devices. I'm really not aware of other codes of practice. Do you know other codes of practice that are out there? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. So Crystal's going to go into the pass-fails on the checklist in detail, but just a little test question. If you're testing the automatic shutoff device, you arrive on site and you see this in the fill pipe. Are you going to write pass or fail on our checklist for that test? Does the owner have an operating automatic shutoff device on this system? No. So we want you to put fail on the test. You don't know how long it's been like that. You don't know if it's been 1 day or 1 year. Have they been bypassing their automatic shutoff device? You put fail, and then in the comments, you can put remove the stick, remove the automatic shutoff, and everything's working fine after my test. Let's pass. But we want to see the fail on the sheet.
One last question. Is it required that an inspector be present during each overfill device test?
No. An inspector is not part of the operation and maintenance test on a spill bucket, sump, leak detection equipment. The owner hires a certified service provider to conduct that test, and I will go over certifications, what's required on what test in a little bit. Okay, the second form that's pretty common is an exterior alarm. So on this test, this 3-year test, you'll want to remove every probe. Make sure the water flows are good, make sure the correct biofuel or diesel or gas float is used for the product floats, make sure they move freely, and that it activates at the 90% level. So regular, I'm going up to 90%, activate, 90% diesel, on and on. Make sure it's correctly monitored. If you're pulling up the diesel one, make sure it's not the regular coming out of the machine. So, okay. Ball float. This has also been an area where there's some misinformation out there. October 1st, 2018 is the date that you cannot install a new ball float. So if you have a new tank going in, no new ball float. If you're doing the test, that 3-year test, and your ball float is not functioning per manufacturer's specifications, you cannot repair it or replace it. So if you have a ball float that's set at 90%, you can't get the stem out because it's rusted because of the ethanol vapors, you have to leave the stem in, then you've got to, their only choice is to go exterior alarm. because you can't have a stem at 90% and then an automatic shut-off valve at 95%. Yes?
Why can't you lower your shut-off valve to 90% match your stem?
It would actually have to be well below 90% because of how things activate. So you might even have to be all the way to 85%. But that would be an option. A lot of owners might not want that option, but you are correct. And if no one heard the question was, instead of going to an exterior alarm if the ball float was damaged and or wasn't working, could they go to an automatic shutoff that was set below the stem percentage inside the tank? So you'd have to go through the whole activation of that automatic shutoff. So some of them would have to be set around 85%, and your service provider should follow the calculations of that automatic shutoff to figure out what percent that would be. But if it activated below the stem, hypothetically it appears the automatic shutoff would be functioning then correctly. Okay, so there is another type of valve out there. OPW has a ball float valve known as an MV30. So those MV30s it's a 30-minute valve. That's what the MV stands for. So a lot of those have been set, depending on the tank diameter and volume, at 3 inches to 5 inches. So it's a very short stem in the tank. So if it's a short stem in the tank and you can't get it removed, the ball's gone, like the service provider said, you could go with an exterior alarm or how you set your automatic shutoff in your fill, as long as it activates lower than the stem that's left in the tank, then it would be functioning per manufacturer's specs. So just a reminder, no new ball floats installed after October 1st, 2018. However, every existing functioning ball float can stay in the tank forever as long as it meets manufacturer specifications. Release detection equipment, that's an annual test. Tag even for existing tanks 2020, tag odd for existing tanks 2021. This is also known as, in the industry, your monitor certification. So the test, Crystal's going to go through all this, so I don't want to go through all the different things. But the test got to follow a manufacturer instruction for whatever type of leak monitor. If you've got a 250i, you follow what that 250i instruction is. If you've got an Incon 750, you check it per that. So our P1200 is a code of practice you can use, and you can use that checklist and attach that data to our form. Repairs. When you repair part of a tank or a piping, be sure within 30 days of that repair, hopefully before you put any product in it, that you have a third-party certified tank tightness test and or line tightness test, depending on what you just repaired. In addition, now that we have requirements on sumps and other equipment, if you repair part of a sump that's used for interstitial monitoring, secondary containment of tanks and piping, like let's say, I don't know, you've got a hole in a piece of fiberglass exterior pipe. Whatever piece of UST component you repair, you have to have some type of test to show your repair is good within 30 days. So if it's kind of an interstitial repair, interstitial test. If it's a sump repair, a sump test. Just whatever you repaired, have it tested within 30 days of the repair. Site assessment. Kathy's going to go into detail on the changes in the regulation for site assessments. We used to have the table for sampling in the site assessment guidance. We now created a new table, and it is now in the regulation. It's broken down into 2 sections. One, how you sample if the tanks are in place. Is drill rig, how you sample. The other half of the table is how you sample if your tank pipe dispenser is removed. How do you do that excavation sampling? So Kathy's going to go into detail on that. Okay, now we'll get into certification. So as an owner, it's really important, and as a service provider, it's important to make sure all your people are correctly certified for whatever work they're doing. So the new walkthrough checklist. This is an example of Washington State's walkthrough checklist. There are no certifications required to do the monthly or the annual walkthrough. So owners will designate someone to do that monthly check. Crystal's going to go into detail. The annual check, the owner could look in every sump, or if the service provider's there every year, they could use their initials and do that annual sump check for the owners, because service providers usually are safer on site than an owner. So safety number one. I'm telling owners, whoever they designate to do that spill bucket check, make sure they are protected. I don't want an 18-year-old cashier down on the ground on their knees and be run over by a car. So when I'm on site, I use 2 vehicles to block off the area I'm going to be working at. And those orange cones and tape, that's icing, because people can drive through cones and tape. They cannot really drive through a car. So whoever you designate to do that monthly check, be sure they are safe. And I'm recommending your service providers there every year, have them do the sump check for you. And people are getting confused. So do I have to do interstitial monitoring if I do my sump check, or is it every sump? If you have a sump on your site that's part of your UST system, that sump, even though it's not interstitially monitored, needs to be checked every year. What am I doing? Same thing as an inspection. Is there rainwater in there? Is there product in there? It's got to be dry and empty, and you deal with rainwater correctly and product correctly, look for a leak. Work with your service provider and call your inspector if you have questions on what to do. There's been changes with site assessment certification. So always an ICC Washington site assessor was accepted to do site assessments. Washington licensed engineers, if their schooling and everything had to do with environmental, could do site assessments during a tank removal or site check. Now we've added Washington licensed hydrogeologists can do that site check, site assessment during a tank removal or a check around existing tanks. So it's a big change for Washington State here. Okay, what type of certification do you need for some other testing? So if you have an ICC tightness tester certification, which is known as a U3, or an ICC installer repair certification known as a U1, you can have either one of those if you do an annual test of the leak detection equipment, known as a monitor certification, but complete testing, the 3-year test of the spill buckets or overfill prevention equipment, or the 3-year test of the sumps used for interstitial monitoring. You can have either one of those certifications. However, if all you have is the ICC tightness tester, the U3, you're fully qualified, of course, to do the tank and line tightness test. But if you're an installer, you can't do those 2 tests. You must have the ICC tank tightness tester certification for those 2 tests. Few changes, or we made it a lot clearer on the CP certification. And if you look at that little handout, I did change, or haven't changed a word on your handout. So the first, under 900, an ICC certified tester, known as the U4, can do CP testing, CP install, and CP repair. And there's a little note at the bottom here for all of these. CP install and repair must be designed and under the direction of the CP expert, including rectifier adjustments. So the CP expert does not have to be on site, but you're under their direction. If you're doing an install of new anodes, maybe you're changing the tap settings, coarse and fine. Okay, second, certifications. If you're an STI certified tester.
It's the old presentation. You pulled up the wrong one.
You pulled up the wrong presentation. Or, so delete that and. So that's the or statement. Or you're a NACE 1, a NACE 2, NACE 3. You can only do CP testing. However, if you're STI and NACE, and you also have a U1, the ICC install repair, you can do the additional CP install and repair under the direction of an expert. If you're a CP expert, you can do all of these activities. CP testing, design, install, repair. Okay, the last section, financial responsibility. There is a big change in this section. So the significant change is there had been some confusion and regulatory interpretation on temporarily closed tanks. In Washington State, we read EPA's regulation and our regulation that closed systems were exempt from the financial responsibility requirements, which is more commonly tank owners have tank insurance. Tank insurance was not needed when you closed a tank. So if you temporarily closed a tank, that was a type of closure. So you remove product from your tank, and what happened? In Washington State, as soon as you remove that product and you let your insurance company know, they dropped you. So it wasn't a violation here because it was exempt in the regulations. However, EPA's interpretation was a little bit different. So they added one word this go around to their regulation, and they said just permanently closed. Not closure with those sections, permanent close. So Ecology worked with PLEA, worked with insurance companies and EPA, and we tried to come up with kind of a solution for owners. Because a lot of states have independent cleanup funds when tanks leak. Washington State's one of the unique states where a lot of people have tank insurance. So we can't control the insurance industry. You know, we can't tell them what to do. They're private. So we came up with, and EPA okayed this in our regulations, they can suspend financial responsibility or tank insurance if the tank is empty and they have a site assessment conducted. So are there any site assessors in the room? Okay. So there could be a lot more bids for site assessments than there have been in the past. So you'd follow the in-place sampling new requirements that Kathy will talk about. And just a little note, just to remind people, if you're a state entity, a federal entity, you're exempt from financial responsibility already and always have been. Is there any questions? I'll put out some cards on the back if you've got any questions. You could also ask your local tank inspector. And here I've got some phone numbers if you're out of the central region, eastern region, northwest, and Crystal works specifically in Whatcom County. She does all of Whatcom County. Southwest region phone numbers, headquarters, Kathy does all the federal facilities west of the mountains and Fairchild Air Force Base on the east side. So if there's any more questions online or in person.
Just have one quick one.
Okay.
Back to the certification monitor and the overfill.
Yep.
If I decide to have external alarm and a mechanical drop tube,
okay, I see both, I'm gonna ask you, which one is your primary, and that's the one I'm gonna look at for violation. So, you let me know as an inspector, which is your primary, and that's the one I'm gonna fill out on my form, as long as there's nothing that I see in the UST system that could make that inoperable.
A question from web here. Spill bucket testing. Can it be vacuum or must it be hydrostatically?
It could be vacuum, pressure, tracer, or another third-party certified method.
All right, so, our next presenter is Kathy Frey, who's worked in the underground storage tank industry for about 30 years, followed as a site assessor in the last 18 years in ecology. She's her focus as an UST inspector at the federal site, so she has some extra clearances that she has to get to do some of those inspections. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy, and she's going to present on some more specifics of the site assessment.
Okay, we're going to go over the highlights of the site assessment revisions to the regulations and the site assessment requirements are effective October 1st, 2018. And along with the site assessment requirements, the International Code Council Washington Site Assessment Test has been revised to meet the regulations as well. And I wanted to share with you how we update and revise the site assessment test. Ecology, along with several Washington State site assessors, come together with the International Code Council, and we all update and revise the test together. So it's a teamwork effort, and so the test will be changed as of October 1st. If you have to recertify, then it will cover the new requirements in the regulation. Also, ecology is trying really hard to have the new site assessment guidance ready by October 1st, 2018. But if by some chance it's not ready, most of the existing site assessment guidance has been pulled into the rule. So as long as you're familiar with the new revisions in the rule, you should do fine on the new site assessment.
Hello, Mr. Diesel.
And the site assessment section is 730, and there's a new site assessment table that's in the rule, and that was in the handout. And while we were working on the new site assessment test, a couple of the site assessors were a little confused at first over this table. So what we've done is take this table and try to break it down for you today. So there will be an increased number of minimum required soil samples, and that is with tanks in place. If you're doing a site assessment and the system is in place, any tank that is less than 9,000 gallons will be 3 soil samples. Tanks greater than or equal to 9,000 gallons, you'll collect 4 soil samples. And a site assessment where the system is removed, if the tanks are less than 9,000 gallons, it's also a minimum of 3 soil samples. If it's equal to or greater than 9,000, you will collect 5 soil samples, a bottom and all 4 sidewalls. And if there are more than 1 tank in the excavation, you will add 2 additional samples per tank. All right, so what we've done is we're going to break it down and show you the sampling for a site assessment around the system with the tank still in place. This is an example of 3 tanks. So this would be a multiple tank situation. You would take 4 soil samples for the first tank, plus 2 additional samples per extra tank. So in this example, we've got 3 tanks, so you would collect a total of 8 soil samples. And for the piping and the dispensers, it would be 1 sample adjacent to, as close as you can get, for every 50 feet of piping, and 1 sample as close as you can get safely adjacent to each dispenser. All right, we've got some examples of a site assessment with the tanks removed. This is a small tank that's less than 9,000 gallons, and you would collect, this is minimum again, minimum required. So for me, I look at this as the perfect world. It's a small tank. There isn't any visual or olfactory evidence, contamination. Your field screening instruments are not showing any contamination. So this would be a minimum required of a sidewall where the piping came in, a bottom, and another sidewall. And if you have a tank that's greater than 9,000 gallons or equal to, then it's 1 bottom sample, a sidewall where the former piping came in, and all of the rest of the sidewalls. So 4 sidewalls and 1 bottom. And we'll show you a diagram of what it would look like if multiple tanks were removed. You would collect 5 samples for your first tank and 2 samples extra for each additional tank. So here we have 3 tanks for a total of 9 soil samples. And the piping and dispenser is going to collect 1 sample per 50 feet of the former piping and 1 sample under each former dispenser. And we changed the excavated soils or the stockpiled soils. So for your stockpiled soils, before our minimum was 3 samples. Well, we changed that. If it's less than 25 cubic yards, less than or equal to 25 cubic yards, 1 soil sample will be sufficient. And less than or equal to 100 cubic yards, collect 3 samples. Less than or equal to 2,000 cubic yards, you will collect 10 soil samples. And greater than 2,000 cubic yards, your 10 soil samples plus 1 extra per 500 cubic yards. You are allowed to take composites in the stockpiled soil, but we don't want to see composites when you're sampling from the excavation. Certifications required. Annette touched on this, and I'm going to go ahead and touch on it again. If you are conducting site assessments in Washington State, you need to be that International Code Council certified site assessor or a Washington licensed engineer, and then our new that we have approved is the Washington licensed hydrogeologist.
Does that include geologists?
It has to be a Washington licensed hydrogeologist. Financial responsibility, that's effective October 1st, 2018. And all temporarily closed tanks must have financial responsibility. My sites are federal, so it doesn't apply to them nor for state facilities. And they can suspend their financial responsibility if they empty the tank and a site assessment is conducted. And this is a protection for the owner as well, to have that done. They're going to, site assessment's a little spendy, but this way it protects them if they find something and they want us to spend, then their insurance will help cover that. And that's it. Short and sweet. Any questions? Okay, great. Oh.
I got one. So for the temporary closed tanks, if it's closed before the October 1st deadline, do they still need financial responsibility, or is it after?
So the question was, how are temporarily closed tanks that are currently temporarily closed going to be handled with this new requirement? So we're putting a letter together to send to all of the temporary closed sites at this time. And the short answer is yes, they will need to have financial responsibility eventually, but we're going to work with them on a site-by-site basis to try to find the best option for them to get to that point.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so our next presentation is going to cover the checklist. How can I get this open here? And the next presenter is Krista Rodriguez. Crystal's an US inspector. She worked over in the central region based out of Yakima and now Union Gap for a number of years. She's just recently moved into the northwest region and works out of the Bellingham field office. And so she's going to talk about basically a number of the checklists we have, the most common checklists we have, and go over sort of what our expectations for those are.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're not interested in kind of learning more about our checklist or how to make sure they're filled out properly, feel free to depart if you would like to, or disconnect. May be a little boring, but I think it's a pretty important topic to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. Down button.
Yeah, or the down button.
Oh, okay. Good. All right. So the goal of this presentation is just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page and try to make it so you don't get those phone calls from the inspectors saying, "What the heck? Why were you there? What did you document? We don't understand this." We're trying to eliminate that and just have a better communication between us. So I'll be going over the leak testing checklist, both of the cathodic protection testing checklists, and then highlighting some common errors to avoid. I'll also go over what we have produced with this walkthrough inspection checklist. That's not necessarily one filled out by service providers, but you guys are the ones on the ground. You're the ones that can also be telling your owners and operators about these. And then also introduce you to our new portal for submitting documents by PDF. Yay! It's pretty exciting. All right. So I just want to highlight that accurate information is really important. We are really looking at these documents to tell us what's going on at a site prior to any inspection. We're only out there, as you know, every 2 to 3 years. And so when we receive this information, it does give us kind of a up-to-date information about what's going on out at the site. It also tells us if you see something different or you've made some changes that are different than what we have in our database. If the piping material is different, the tank monitor has been installed, that is giving us all that update on that on a regular basis. And it also gives us an opportunity, if we see that some equipment has failed, gives us an opportunity to call the operator and just make sure they're on track for getting that repaired. I think sometimes they know that they've paid their bill and they just think everything's done, but there are some extra steps sometimes required. And our goal is to make sure that they're remaining in compliance so that when they have an inspection, they aren't receiving penalties or violations. We're trying to stay on top of that. Oh, and a reminder that we will be updating these checklists. So the ones I'm about to go over are the ones you've been working with for the past several years. But we will be making some changes to them with these new regulations. And we are accepting comments and suggestions we know. Do you have one?
How about a date right at the top of the...
Yeah. Yep, it's on one of them, and we're gonna make sure it's a great spot. A service provider suggested that to us, and we listened, and it just didn't make it to all of them. But I've been closely involved in all of the creations of all these checklists, and so I'm a great person to get in touch with, at least have your initial comments. I left my business cards up there if you want to grab them, and just let me know what areas work and what don't work. But we do always keep them updated on our website, so just make sure you're checking those. And then Chris Grinnell keeps a list of all the service provider names and companies. He tries to send out those reminders when there are new forms. So if you haven't been receiving those from him, make sure you get on that list. Did you have something? No. Oh. All right, so each of our checklists, we've tried to maintain consistency on these checklists, and they all include these sections. I'll go over a little bit. Might be a little tedious, but I'm trying to highlight some areas that we've seen some problems. The first section is just about the facility. Seems like an easy section to fill out, but it does often have incorrect information on it. At a minimum, we would like to see the facility compliance tag number. Every facility that's been registered with the state will have a compliance tag. If you happen to come across one that doesn't have one, we would definitely want to know about that. Or the SID number. So you can use either of those two numbers to identify the facility. One of those two at least is really helpful. And that way, if your site name is different than ours or the address is a little bit off, that's not as big of a deal. And a site phone number is great too, just so we can reach out to those folks. And for those of you that are service providers, we would really love to have your contact information. So if we do have any questions, we can just contact you directly. Email works great, and that way you can answer on your own time. We know a lot of you are really busy, and so you don't necessarily want that phone call from us. So we do check that you're currently certified, so having your certification information there is really helpful. We do, with the ICC, we do check those online as well to make sure that those are current. And then if you can jot down the name of the owner-operator that you've been working with, the one that approved the work to be conducted, the testing, that's helpful for us too, just so we know who's been getting the information about any problems with the testing or failed results. It also lets us know if there has been a change in owner. The regulations do require that they let us know within 30 days, but that doesn't always happen. And so sometimes this is the way we find out that there's a change in operator, and they may not even realize, what all they need to do. The site diagram is something that we've added to all the checklists. That is really helpful if you can at least get it down that first time, and then you can reuse that drawing as long as it remains accurate on each future visit. We really would like you to add the number. If they have a tank monitor, you can match the numbers up, tank T1, T2, but also the product that's being stored. That product is really the identifier that helps us know that we're talking about the same tank. Because sometimes the number on the tank monitor does not match the one on the business license, which is what ends up in our database. And so we just want to make sure we're discussing the same thing. Also, seeing those dispenser numbers on there is helpful for your leak detector testing. We know which dispenser you're doing that at. A north arrow is nice for just general site diagram following that. And then if you're doing CP testing, then noting where your hostile locations or where you're taking those readings, jotting those down there. And you can just write number 1, number 2, and you can lay out your survey that way too. If you want to be a gold star service provider, adding some extra features on there is great too, where the CP rectifier is, the tank monitor, an overfill alarm, just noting where they are on the building. That's all helpful. We certainly accept extra information. signatures. Each of the forms require the service provider signature and a signature of the representative authority, or I don't remember how it's worded, authorized representative. We may be rejecting those in the future if we don't have some sort of signature from the site, somebody from the facility, and we're kind of working on how to manage that. We know we would prefer to see the signature on that same form if you can get that, and I'm seeing some, oh, that's impossible. We know this is really difficult, and we're trying to come up with some creative ideas on how we can get that signature so that we know that there's been some communication, we know that they're receiving the failed results. That's the main goal, is we're wanting to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So you can talk to Chris about that. If that's like just impossible for you to get that signature on there, Chris is the one that I think, don't you think, Chris is probably the best person to talk to about what you guys, what's the easiest way for you guys to get that taken care of, or what you can provide to us to substitute for that. So the next one is the leak testing checklist. As Hugh mentioned, we've got the date right on the top there. That's kind of a goal. We'll get that on all of them when we update them this next time. The leak testing checklist was updated in March 2016, so this should be the form that you're using. And it included a requirement to document the certification type for each service provider, and for you to be including the supporting documentation, so not just the ecology checklist. We wanted to see the form that shows when you did your spill bucket testing, if you did a hydrostatic, the start and stop times, and for the leak detector testing, we're seeing all the data right there on that form. So if you're just submitting this checklist, that is not enough. It's got to include the extra supporting documentation, or it will be rejected. This section is sort of the nemesis of everybody. What we tend to be seeing is this section being filled out based on what's in our database. And what we want to see is what you're seeing on the ground, what you're observing on that day. So there are plans to probably change this section, so we're maybe just having the tank ID, capacity, product stored, more information that's really useful to us. Like I said, we want it to be based on your observation.
Question?
Yes.
For new installation, we do the hydrostatic test at that time when the excavation's open. Then when our paperwork's going to be turned in for the tank information and it's completed, there'll be 2 different dates on it. Is there a spot for that? Because when we finish the job before the obviously set the dispensers on there, fully operational, it might be 30 days out.
So 2 different dates from the
hydrostatic test
and the
tank checklist.
Oh, I would just submit. So the question is if there are 2 different dates for a new install on the hydrostatic testing versus maybe the tightness testing of the equipment. I think that you can fill out 2 different forms for that. We want the form to be for one date that all the testing was performed. So if you have completed those on 2 separate dates, especially if they're 30 days or 2 months apart, I think 2 forms would make sense. If you're just talking about a few days, you could probably figure out a way to note that in there. Just find the form at the end. Maybe have the last day conducted, and you can make some notes in the comment section that you've done that all about the same time. But if you want to go that way, I think that we'd all accept that. So we do know this section doesn't work. So if you have any suggestions on what information you would like to note and what you don't have to give it to me right now, but how we can improve on this to document what's going on at the site. I think we all want to make sure you're conveying the information so that we can understand it. We all want to be getting to that place. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. This was probably the biggest change to this checklist back then, is we tried to note every single type of test that we expect to see, and some of these will now become requirements. The leak detector, the ALD, automatic line leak detector test, that's been there for a while. We did add the noting which method you're using and a date of when you were certified for the manufacture of that testing equipment. We are requiring that. It's been a little loosey-goosey in the past, but we do want to be seeing that come in. And then we've got all that spot there for adding comments for the leak detector testing. That would be a great spot to note if there are satellite dispensers that you were testing from that farthest dispenser. You can make a note that there are satellite dispensers and you test, where you tested. And then you can also make a note that if one of your leak detectors failed, obviously you would check the fail button, and then you could say, yeah, but we replaced it and it's working now. One other suggestion that we've come up with, and I think we'll move forward on, is adding another column, a pass, a fail, and a replace and now it's passing box. I think that will kind of clarify that, because I think a lot of service providers are not, or I should say the owners maybe, don't want to see any fails on their checklist. And so we're going to put in a place of what you saw on the day that you arrived, which was a fail, but when you left the site, it's now working properly. For the line tightness testing, it also, we're looking for a manufacturer certification for the method that was used, and noting which lines that you did the testing on. The sensor, the line official sump sensor test line, that gets a little more complicated because now there's sensors in the dispensers and transition sumps and the STP sumps. We do prefer that you put some comments there and outline exactly where those sensors are located and which ones were tested. Sometimes we'll just see that, 8 were tested, and we know there are only 3 tanks, so that gets a little confusing. And that's where the diagram really helps. But if it's all laid out there in the comment section, that's really helpful for us as inspectors. Tank tightness test, if that was conducted, you could certainly note on there why it was conducted. That's sort of an anomaly. If someone's doing that, it's usually a sign that they're either coming out of temporary closure or they've actually detected there's a suspected leak going on. So if you could just explain that on there, that's definitely a good idea. And then with the overfill, as Annette was mentioning earlier, you certainly can have more than one method in place, and you want to make sure they're not contradicting each other. If any of them don't work, then you want to press the fail box and identify, if any of them, which ones are working and which ones are not working. And you can even include the steps that you conducted to complete that test, especially with the overfill alarm. Verified it was at 90%, and each tank was set that way, and that it was tested from the output relay. We definitely don't want to see anyone pushing the button outside to test their overfill alarm. We're wanting to make sure there's communication between the probe and each tank and the tank monitor. Yeah, and then the same with the spill bucket test. If any of them have failed, it should be checking a fail. Even if you've got 3 that passed, 1 failed, we want the fail button box checked. And that really highlights, you're really doing the owner or operator a favor by outlining where they need to do some work. Try not to hide anything, I guess, in there. So just to make sure, what we're looking for are the satellite dispensers are present. Make sure you're identifying that you've tested the leak detector from that farthest dispenser in that product line. We want to make sure that leak detector can detect a leak throughout the entire product line. And if you want to include comments about that you visually identified where those solenoids are located, that's also helpful information. Just that you've noticed they seem to be installed correctly, and that leak detector can see the entire line. The number of locations of each of your sensors that were tested, that you're current with the certification by the manufacturer, and you feel free to add any extra comments you want in there. If you happen to not do tank monitor certification or test, but you want to just note that they have a VIA Route 450 or TLS 450, feel free to just make a note of that. But don't check any boxes unless you did the full test, per the regulations. little bit more about the overfill devices. We already discussed this because Ruben was like, or no, it was Steve was asking if you want to make sure that it can activate at the applicable level, so that's 90 or 95, depending upon which method you're using, and it'll activate when that product reaches that level. And we'll be changing the wording on our checklist to call this a test now, instead of right now it says a check, which may have been more of a visual check. For the tank monitor, it does require removal of the probes based on all these different codes of practice. The regulations don't require that, but all the different methods do. Make sure the proper operation of alarms, the system's configured properly. One thing to keep your eyes open for is the default for the CSLD on the probability of detection for doing that test method is 95%, but to be in compliance with the third-party certification, it should be set at 99%. So that's one thing to kind of keep your eyes open. We're still kind of seeing a lot of those at the incorrect level, and that test is invalid at the wrong level, the wrong probability of detection. And also do your service providers a favor. Make sure they're not exceeding throughput, especially when they've got CSLD. You can be printing out that CSLD diagnostics printout, and it'll tell you what their average throughput is on a monthly basis. I just discovered this setting a few months ago, and I was very excited about it. Because if they're exceeding the throughput of the third-party certification, they cannot use that method. So they'll need to find another method, maybe that's CITLDS or SIR, but with CSLD, they may be maxed out there. And I'm finding this up in Whatcom County on those sites next to the border with all the Canadians coming down from the north. They are just so busy, even though they're not a truck stop. It just totally surprised me. And then just make sure with that third-party certification, if they've got manifolded tanks, that allows them to use manifolded tanks, because they do need to be in compliance with that third-party certification. And then you're also looking to make sure that the probes, those are removed, like I said, make sure those floats are moving freely, there's no buildup of residue, and you're just checking all those alarms. And the light bulbs, those same light bulbs that keep going out, just have a bunch of those in your trucks and replace them when you see them not working. So we've been mentioning any of these tests need to follow RP 1200, that's PEI, RP 1200, or manufacturer instructions. Any failed equipment, we want to see a failed check checked on the checklist, and that you must be certified by the manufacturer. You can see I'm repeating these several times, trying to make sure you're listening. And then explain why the testing has been conducted. It's outside the normal testing frequency. As I mentioned earlier, the tank tightness test is a really common one that we see. Like, why the heck are they testing tank 1? And then somebody will check, we're out here for our normal compliance inspections. Like, no, that's not required for that site. So we do want to just see notes as to why you're out there. It's not so that we can go give them a penalty, but it just keeps us informed. And a line tightness test, oftentimes we'll see just one line being tested. If you can explain that, or a leak detector, oftentimes they can't be replaced the day that they were being tested, either because it's seized on there or there's not a spare one in the truck. So if there's a reason to go back and do testing on a different day and replace that equipment, just make a note, like, this is a follow-up to the June 6th site visit, and now we're going back and explaining why we're out there. And this checklist has a section for the service providers to basically say, we followed all the requirements, the owner's been provided a written documentation, and they've also been notified if there's any failed equipment. So you're signing your life away here by noting that you've done that. Any questions or comments on the leak testing checklist before I move on? All right. So we've got 2 cathodic protection system testing checklists. They were updated last year in August, and well, it seems earlier than that. Maybe I have the year wrong. And this on our end as far as understanding where you guys are doing your work. We broke down the different components, steel components that are being tested, and also had a section that includes what the next steps for the operator are. It's more clearly laid out on this one. And I don't anticipate any big changes to these other than putting the date at the top. So if something is not working on this, we would really like to hear from you. As we mentioned, really common, you might be surprised to hear, but it's really common just to see these boxes not checked at all. So just make sure you're filling that out. And right now, until we get this new form done, the date the test was performed is really just tucked away there in that first page. So it's often been left blank. So make sure that you're getting that filled out. Just kind of check over your work before you're submitting it and make sure it's really complete. And if it doesn't have that information, if boxes are not checked and the dates aren't on there, it will be rejected by ecology. And this, like I said, this is one of the best sections I think we added to it, which is really laying out exactly the number of steel components that have been tested. And we wanted to make sure, the old checklist just had tanks and piping, and now we broke it down so those flex connectors can be grabbed, or whatever steel portion of piping is on those ends of the fiberglass piping runs. And you've got 3 different options for passing those tests. And just a reminder that the purpose of the testing is to make sure the anode is protecting the intended structure. So this may mean for a Type 3 tank that there are no dielectric unions. We want to be seeing those installed because that is how the cathodic protection system is meant to work. Steel components must be tested against another to prove there's no continuity between structures on a galvanic system, like I was saying with the Type 3 tanks. Each of our checklists have instructions in them, and they include examples of how each of those lines can be filled out. So just take a look at that and make sure you've got data entered into all the required spots. For the impressed current checklist, there is an extra page about the rectifier, and this is really important for the owners and operators to know this because they're the ones that are doing those every 2 months or monthly rectifier inspections. Every time the TPA system is tested, they do need to update the volts and amps readings to make sure they're current, so any adjustments to the rectifier might adjust these numbers. And make sure you discuss that with the owner and operator so that they know which numbers they're looking for to stay within on their monthly inspections. As I think Annette mentioned, if there are any rectifier adjustments made, a CP expert must approve that change. They don't need to be on site, but they do need to sign the checklist that they've approved those changes to the rectifier. So some common errors to avoid is using pre-populated information and basing it on the last time you were out there. It's great if that information is still current, but just double check it each time and make sure that it is what you're seeing that day. Leaving pass-fail boxes unchecked, not including the testing date, checking the pass button even when there's been a equipment that has failed. We see that all the time. And sometimes it's tucked way back in on the supporting document. It's like, oh yeah, the annular sensors aren't working. It's like, but you checked pass on the first page. It does happen. You shouldn't be checking the ATG box that you've done the test unless there's a removal of the probe. And signing having the CP expert sign that signature, or sign the checklist if there's been any retrofits or repairs to that CP system. So this next slide is about those walkthrough inspection checklists that can be done by the owner or operator. We've got 2 forms that we created. One is covering, or one is for equipment that is single wall, where the spill buckets and the containment sumps are single wall, and they are following the requirements for single wall equipment. And the second one is for double wall equipment when they want to start relying on those gauges, for example. And then we have a separate form for that. This form's not required to be used, but it covers all the requirements. It's a one-shot deal. It's pretty handy. And these are available online. And a reminder that the first inspections need to be completed by October 2019, or upon installation if it's a new system. So for the 30-day inspection requirement, and this is just, if you're not an owner-operator, you could be just informing your clients on this. They need to be visually checking spill buckets for damage, just like if you've been on an inspection, just kind of like how we do during an inspection, looking at it, removing any liquid or debris that's found in the spill bucket. And if there's a stick in the fill pipe, for example, then that would need to be removed. That's another thing they need to be looking for. We're also have added to it that the cap on the fill port needs to be tight on there. There are a lot of loose ones on there, so they need to be replaced if the vapors can be escaping. And if it's a double-walled spill bucket, then they could be looking at the gauges on the interstitial space to meet this monthly requirement.
We have a question. It says, what CP checklist is to be used for changing ranges of volts or amps during an occasion other than testing?
Oh, I haven't really seen that. So if they've gone out there, somebody has noticed, I guess we probably...
CP checklist,
yeah,
that would have page 5 with the minimum and maximum volt ranges.
Yeah, I think they wouldn't need to fill out the whole checklist, but probably just that one page that has, or is the CP test required for making those changes? They would have to test it afterwards, so they would have to fill out the CP checklist. Yeah. So that would document.
And then the signature of the CP expert.
Right. Yeah, great question. For the release detection equipment, checking for alarms and unusual operating conditions, you're on a monthly basis, you're just making sure that there aren't any active alarms or they're getting addressed. The back of the walkthrough inspection form has a spot for documenting all the alarms or any unusual operation and noting that you've had it replaced. And then also making sure that somebody is keeping those monthly leak detection records. So if you're doing the 0.2 gallon per hour leak test, making sure that there's an actual passing result about every 30 days. So you'd be checking a box showing that's been done. We're almost done, guys. On the walkthrough inspections, the annual requirements include a visual inspection of the containment sump area, removing any liquidated debris there. And if they've got double-wall containment sumps, also you can be looking at that gauge that's on there. If they're using a gauging stick, you'd be making sure that that has their 1/8 inch increments on there and that they're easily visible and that the bottom of the stick is still in good condition so that the readings are accurate. So as I mentioned, we'd love to hear from you. You can surely get in touch with me if you have any suggestions on how to improve our forms. I think we'll be trying to do that in the next several months or soonish. So if we don't have any big changes, that can happen pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm certainly a good person, or just get in touch with your inspector and ask them to pass it on. So this TCP External Document Submission Portal, or as we're calling TED, this is a way for you to submit your checklist as owner-operators or as service providers. Submit them electronically, so we no longer must have a hard copy of these checklists. And so this is going to be really nice. We're now accepting PDFs, so it can be a scanned version of the checklist and all the supporting documents. Right now we're just accepting 4 checklists, the 2 CP checklists, leak testing checklist, and retrofit repair checklist. Those are the 4 most common ones we see. And we're going to just kind of see how this works. And then we're hoping to add on some new ones like the 30-day notice, maybe the permanent closure checklist, and like site assessment checklist. We're definitely planning to expand it, but we're going to start with these 4 right now. For the testing checklist, it'll go through a 2 review process. One will start at headquarters, and here are 2 headquarters folks. They will be reviewing them as they come in and checking to make sure kind of more the basic information is in there. They know which site it belongs to. It's got a test date, pass and fail boxes are checked, signatures are on there. After they're done reviewing that, it'll go to the inspector for that area. So I'll see all the ones coming to Whatcom County, and I will do more what we're calling a technical review, making sure all the information makes sense on there. If not, at either of those two stages, we can reject the checklist electronically, and we can shoot back an email to you and say, here's what's missing, here's what we need, and you can resubmit another one. But this can all be happening electronically. For those of you technologically inclined, I think this is going to be really nice, and hopefully just save bunches of trees and save you guys some money in submitting those for your customers.
Then we have a question. If you could please repeat the 4 checklists that are now being accepted.
Sure. It's the 2 CP checklists, the cathodic protection checklist, the leak testing checklist, and the retrofit repair checklist. I think it's actually on my next 2 slides from now, so you'll see them up there. So to use TES, you need to have a secure access Washington account or SAW account. So another username and another password, but this gets you into this database, or not database, but this portal. Any questions about doing this? I think it's pretty straightforward, but if you did have questions, you can contact Kelly Fox. She's with the IT folks in our office, in the headquarters office. There's a list of the 4 checklists that we're accepting. So once you're in TES, there's instructions at the top. We've had service providers test this, and it seems to be working pretty well. We've been going back and forth and making improvements on it. The instructions are right at the top. I think it's pretty straightforward. You can upload 10 documents at a time, and you can name them whatever you want to. It doesn't matter. And they'll just look like that. And then you can upload them. And then the next stage, it'll say, oh, more information is needed. And it'll require you to identify this checklist and tie them to the facility. And so that will be either adding the SID number or the facility compliance tag. And then we're going to want to see, and then you'll from a drop-down menu, you'll select which checklist it is, and then also add the date that it was signed, which we're hoping is the same date that the service was performed. And then when you have an account, you'll be able to take a look in TES, and you can review all of the documents that you've submitted, and you can take a look at the status and see if they're in review, they're accepted, and the other one was rejected. So I think those are the 3 statuses that are there. And so you can kind of take a look and see which ones you might need attention.
Crystal, will this be done per individual or per company?
Anybody can do it, yeah, so an individual can do it. Is that answering your question?
Right, so those papers turned into the office and then they're submitted out of the office?
Okay.
Would it be like that, or would it preferably have the technicians doing all the information and send it in?
Yeah, the question is whether it has to be the company or an individual service provider can use TES, and it can be either one. It's an individual that signs up for it, so it's whatever agreement you have with your company. If they want you to be doing it individually, then that's how you can do it. I think some of the companies, there's somebody in the office that's going to be doing this all for them, but that's up to you guys. We don't care. We'll take them however we can get them. But again, Kelly Fox is the person to get in touch with. She's worked with a team to make this better than the last version that we sent out. By receiving them as a PDF, I think that's really going to help a lot. And this is my last slide. This is, again, a map of our regions. Kathy is headquarters down in the southwest region, but just as part of the headquarters office. And I'm way up in the north in Whatcom County. And those are just our phone numbers to our reception, and you can just ask to speak to an inspector if you need it, you have some questions. Any questions?